She was one of the last true pioneers of Appalachia, a fiercely strong and independent mountain woman. This is the true story of Aunt Sophie. The year is 1805, and Thomas Ogle and his young wife have spent the past 4 months migrating from the state of Georgia across the rugged Smoky Mountains into eastern Tennessee, where the young couple settles in a narrow valley located at the foot of Mount LeConte. The valley was a paradise, the mountains wrapped around it like a mother's arms, isolating it from the outside world. There was a beautiful, crystal-clear mountain river, brimming with fish, majestic timber stands, bountiful wild game, and plenty of fertile soil, everything a man needed to raise a family. So it was here that the Ogle family decided to build their lives. Using little more than an axe, Thomas felled trees and used the logs to build a modest cabin and a rail fence that carved out his little piece of the mountains, and they settled into their new homeland. They named this Garden of Eden White Oak Flats, and here the couple would raise 14 young'uns in this paradise. Over time, a few other families arrived and also made this magical place their home, building a church to worship and educate their children. Because of its isolation, the people who lived here were a hardy breed. They raised all their own food and made all their own tools, implements, clothing, and furniture. They learned the ancient crafts of basket weaving and broom making from the natives who also lived in the area. And for the next 50 years, the small inhabitants of this valley thrived and grew underneath the shadow of the mighty Smoky Mountains. It was here that a little girl named Sophie Ogle was born in 1855. Born of the same pioneer stock as her grandfather, Sophie roamed the mountains barefooted, just as freely as the animals did. She played in rows of corn taller than she was, climbed the sturdy branches of the chestnut trees, learned to spear fish, and was an excellent shot with her father's hog-killing rifle. She followed her pa, who was a lean, weathered man with hands as calloused as rocks, as he plowed the fields or chopped firewood, and he'd tell her, "Sophie, this land's been good to us. It'll keep you safe and feed you if you treat it right." Sophie was a child of the mountains, connected to the land and the animals of the forest. Her mother taught her how to spin wool and weave cloth, to can and preserve, and to make medicines from herbs that she picked from the woods. Sophie would watch wide-eyed as her mother boiled sassafras roots to make tea or pulled fresh greens from the ground to add to the evening meal. She spent countless hours wandering through the woods, learning the songs of the birds and the tracks of the deer. She felt as though the mountains were part of her, in her blood, her bones. Occasionally, travelers or traders would pass through. Their packs would be loaded with things she had never seen: brightly dyed cloth, shiny tin cups, and even a strange little lantern that didn't use fire at all. She'd listen to their tales of far-off cities and bustling towns, places where people lived shoulder to shoulder, where the nights were lit up brighter than the day. She listened to their tales of Roman railroad tracks being laid down south and cities growing like weeds across the land. She watched with fascination, but she felt no pull to join that life. The mountains, her father said, would shield her from the world's rushing tide. However, little did he know that what was about to happen would forever change this mountain paradise.
Give someone you love the gift of old-fashioned storytelling today. 2 volumes that'll make your heart smile. Click the link below or visit the appalachianstoryteller.com to order your copies today.
So it was. Sophie grew up mountain strong, living on her family farm. She was a fierce, independent woman who was now in her early 20s. Many folks openly wondered why she hadn't been married by now. But the truth was that Sophie was waiting on a man who was just as strong and independent as she was. And that finally happened in 1879, when a man named Tom Campbell was hired to work on the Ogle farm. Now, Tom wasn't much to look at. His clothes were well worn and dirty, and he didn't have much money. But when it came to work, Tom could work circles around other men, clearing the land and chopping wood, mending fences, or plowing all day long behind a mule. Tom could do it all. He himself had grown up just like Sophie, wild and free. And before long, the pair got spliced down at the Baptist church. Tom took all the money he had in the world, $7.80, and he bought 25 acres high atop Harrison Mountain, which overlooked the valley below. The mountaintop, it was a utopia. There was a big spring full of the sweetest tasting water. Dogwoods and redbud trees were flowering, and they were magnets for wild honeybees. Yes, sir, it was perfect for Tom and Sophie. No neighbors, and no one from the outside world to bother them either. Tom got busy building a home for his new bride. He chopped down trees and hewed them into logs for a small cabin that he built to Sophie's wishes. He split boards for the roof and chopped rock out of the side of the mountaintop for a chimney and a hearth. But he still needed boards for the flooring, so he carried them up plank by plank, 2 miles up each trip to the top of the steep mountain. And I mean steep. You see, no 4-legged critter or no wagon or cart, nothing on wheels, had ever made the zagged and twisty climb to the top. All totaled, Tom carried 1,500 feet of pine and poplar up the mountain on his back, and as a wedding gift for Sophie, he even carried a cast-iron cook stove to the very top. There the 2 mountain pioneers lived and raised their crops and their children. Tom eventually carried up a baby calf, some chickens, and a pig up the mountain, and he even managed to get a small mule up to the top. That's right, Tom and Sophie had built a kingdom in the clouds, and there, for the next 40 years, they would remain hidden from the outside world. And once their children were grown, each one headed off down to the valley below to start their own lives, leaving Sophie and Tom to live alone with the animals on top of Harrison Mountain. Yet, winds of change began blowing across the hills and hollers, and the outside world began creeping in. First, there was that road that they cut down in the valley, and soon, folks from the outside world were now showing up in automobiles from faraway lands like Knoxville, and they were there to buy the handcrafted items produced by the local craftsmen. Everything from linens, rugs, tapestries, furniture, jewelry, and cigarette boxes, even bookends. With all this new attention from those outsiders, word began to spread far and wide about this majestic valley sitting at the foot of the Smoky Mountains. And by the 1920s, the area even caught the attention of the government. And I'm sure you know by now, the most feared words a man can ever hear is, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." I tell you, no truer words have ever been spoken. And suddenly, the government decided that all the land the mountaineers were living on should be a national park. Sophie and Tom watched as one by one, all of the small hillside farms were bought by the government, and longtime neighbors moved away. Those who fought the government and tried to remain were simply removed by eminent domain. And let's be honest, eminent domain is just a fancy word for legal thievery. Sophie and Tom were one of the few original families who were able to remain as the small valley was gobbled up by investors. Suddenly, their small valley was becoming a tourist attraction, and even the name was changed from White Oak Flats to Gatlinburg. That's right, Gatlinburg had become the gateway to the Smokies, and tourists began flocking in by the tens of thousands. Hotels sprang up everywhere, and this once hidden oasis was being featured in magazines and newspapers all across the world.
Hey guys, JD Phillips here from the Appalachian Storyteller, and we're here on site in Gatlinburg, Tennessee at White Oak Flats Cemetery, And this is where Sophia Campbell is buried. Now, she's buried right under this tree right here. And I wanted to go over there, and I actually did go over there, and I was going to film her grave, but I kept feeling something falling on my head, and I looked up, and there's a mama bear right there in that tree, and she's eating some nuts, and I'm not going to bother her. But anyways, Sophia is buried right under that tree, and she lived during her life on this mountain up here behind me. And when she died, they wanted to take a casket up there and bury her on top of the mountain, but it was so steep, they literally couldn't get the casket up there. So they put Sophia gently in a sheet and like a hammock. They brought her down that mountain right there, and they buried her right here at White Oak Flats Cemetery, underneath that tree where that mama bear is now. And now, back to the story.
Before long, tourists learned about the old couple who were still living on top of the mountain that overlooked Gatlinburg, and they began fording the river and making the long climb to the top of the mountain to visit them. They marveled at Sophie's handmade tobacco pipes and Tom's hand-carved furniture. The tourists craved to just sit on the porch and listen to them tell of how the mountains used to be. At first, Sophie and Tom didn't know what to make about all this attention, but being the wily and canny mountaineers that they were, they adapted. They began welcoming the tourists, and Tom sold them hand-carved trinkets and fresh honey, while Sophie sold them fresh, hot pies and handmade clay pipes that she had hardened on the fireplace. The old couple were now living windows into the past, some of the last pioneers who the world now knew as Uncle Tom and Aunt Sophie. By 1930, National Geographic reporters even climbed to the top of Harrison Mountain to meet the couple who were now in their 70s. Aunt Sophie beamed with pride as she talked about her boy who lived just across the gap, or her gal who had moved off to Alabama. Sophie had spent her entire life in these mountains, and when the reporter asked her if she could have one wish, what would it be? Sophie took a long toke off of her pipe, and with a faraway look in her eyes, she looked out over the mountains that had been her home for so long, and she said, "I'd like to see the ocean with my own eyes." Yet it would never be, because on a cold winter day in January of 1936, Aunt Sophie Campbell passed away peacefully in the cabin that she had lived in for 45 years, the same one that Tom had built for her. When folks down in Gatlinburg got the news, a group of men shoveled their way through the snow and ice to the top of Harrison Mountain, and they gently and lovingly carried Aunt Sophie's body down the mountain and laid her to rest in White Oak Flats. As for Uncle Tom, now he remained on the mountain with his hunting dogs and the wild animals as his only friends. One autumn morning, as the leaves were turning crimson and gold, Tom sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The world outside was quiet, and there, in the warmth of their cabin, he closed his eyes for one last time, his spirit finally at rest, ready to join Sophie on the other side. The men of Gatlinburg found him a day later, sitting in his chair, his hands folded in his lap, his face peaceful. They carried him down the mountain, just as they had Sophie, and laid him to rest right beside her. The last of the old mountain ways were now gone. Today, 14 million people a year visit Gatlinburg. The once small valley, known as White Oak Flats, is now packed full of hotels, restaurants, and gift shops, all owned by multi-billion-dollar corporations. Most folks today visit for moonshine tastings and quick wedding ceremonies. Most of them have no idea of the history of the old pioneers, such as Uncle Tom and Aunt Sophie, who still rest today in a small cemetery just a few feet off the tourist-packed streets. And as for Sophie and Tom's cabin up on the mountain, well, it was bulldozed years ago to build a ski resort now known as Gatlinburg. What an incredible story of Uncle Tom and Aunt Sophie, two of the last pioneers of Gatlinburg. As for that bear in the cemetery, I like to think that she was just keeping an eye on Aunt Sophie and Uncle Tom's graves. It sure took me by surprise as I looked up and saw that she was right above my head, looking down on me. And I can tell you this, when you got a black bear's full attention, you best get out of her space. So that's exactly what I did. Once I got out of harm's way, I sent up my drone to take a picture of Sophie's bear. And as I close this story today, I'll share it with you. Till next time, my friends, be sure to like and subscribe for more true stories from Appalachia.